The night was mercilessly cold, the wind howling through the barren land like a predator stalking its prey. Maximus moved slowly, his once mighty frame now weakened by hunger and exhaustion. Each step was a battle against the weight of his own body, his powerful muscles now trembling beneath his matted fur. The scars from his past fights etched deep into his skin, reminders of the brutal world he had known. His breath came out in short, ragged puffs, rising into the air before vanishing into the endless darkness. Days had passed without food, and his stomach twisted painfully, gnawing at him like a relentless beast. Survival had always been his only instinct. He had fought for scraps, torn through flesh, and stood victorious over countless opponents in the savage pits of battle. But here, in the middle of nowhere, he was nothing but a fading shadow, a warrior stripped of purpose. Then, a scent. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably different from the sense of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was weak, fragile, yet alive. His sharp senses instantly sharpened, his body tensing. Prey! Adrenaline surged through his veins, momentarily pushing aside the hunger-induced haze clouding his mind. His ears pricked, nose twitching as he followed the scent, moving with a hunter's precision. His paws crunched against the frozen ground, silent, measured, predatory. The closer he got, the stronger it became. And then, through the moonlit grass, he saw it. A bundle of frayed blankets, barely visible in the darkness. And within it, a child. Maximus froze, his breath hitching. The hunger in his gut twisted violently, but something else, something foreign, held him still. His amber eyes locked onto the tiny, helpless form. This was no prey. This was something else entirely. Maximus stood motionless, his massive frame casting a dark shadow over the fragile bundle before him. His breath came in slow, measured huffs, misting in the frigid night air. His sharp amber eyes locked onto the tiny form nestled within the torn fabric. The scent, weak, unfamiliar, was unlike anything he had ever known. Not prey, not predator. Something else. Something vulnerable. His stomach clenched painfully, the hunger inside him a feral beast, relentless and merciless. He needed food. His body, honed by years of brutal survival, demanded sustenance. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, to keep moving, to find something, anything, to fill the aching void in his belly. Yet, he didn't move. Something held him there, something foreign that clawed at his chest with the same intensity as his hunger. His powerful jaws, once accustomed to sinking into flesh, remained still. His paws, trained to lunge and take down threats, refused to take a single step forward. The baby whimpered, a sound so soft it barely broke the silence. But to Maximus, it might as well have been a roar. It rattled through him, sending a strange shiver down his spine. His ears twitched, his heart pounded, not with the thrill of the hunt, but with something far more unsettling. This creature was completely defenseless, smaller than any opponent he had ever faced, weaker than any prey he had ever stalked. It had no fangs, no claws, no means to escape or fight back. It was utterly helpless. And yet, Maximus lowered his head slightly, inching closer. His hunger still clawed at him, but another force, deeper, more primal, began to rise, drowning out the relentless pangs. Not to consume, but to protect. Maximus took a deep breath, his powerful frame tensing as he grasped the edge of the thin, tattered blanket in his jaws. The child barely stirred, its tiny body limp from exhaustion. The cold wind bit at his fur, but he ignored it. There was no time to hesitate. Step by step, he moved forward, his movements slow and deliberate. The weight of the baby wasn't much, but the responsibility pressing down on him was immense. Every instinct he had, every lesson learned from years of brutal survival, urged him to drop the child and fend for himself. But he didn't. The landscape stretched before him, dark and unforgiving. The moon cast a pale glow over the ground, revealing twisted branches and uneven terrain. His paws sank into damp earth as he pushed forward, navigating through the underbrush. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every whisper of wind sent his ears twitching. He was no longer just a lone warrior. He was a guardian now. A rustling sound came from the distance. Maximus froze, his ears perked, his breath shallow. His muscles coiled, ready to defend, but nothing emerged from the darkness. Still, he knew he couldn't stay in the open for long. His legs burned with fatigue, but he pressed on. He had never carried anything before, never protected something so fragile. Yet, As the child whimpered softly, he felt something inside him harden with resolve. Somewhere out there, a safe place existed. Shelter, warmth. He just had to find it. Maximus lifted his head, amber eyes scanning the horizon. Then, with careful determination, he kept moving, because for the first time in his life, his fight wasn't just for himself. Maximus pushed forward, his legs heavy, his body screaming for rest. The baby remained motionless in the bundle of fabric, its breathing barely audible beneath the steady howl of the wind. Every step Maximus took was an effort, his vision blurring from exhaustion. He needed to find shelter. He needed to find water. Then, a scent, faint but unmistakable. The scent of water drifted through the crisp night air, cutting through the damp earth and decaying leaves. A new urgency surged through Maximus. His tongue was dry, his throat burned, but he knew the baby needed it even more than he did. His ears twitched, tracking the faint trickle of flowing water. With renewed determination, he pressed forward, weaving through the thick underbrush. His paws sank into the cold, damp soil, but he barely noticed. The sound grew stronger, the scent more distinct. And then, through the tangled branches, he saw it. A small creek, winding through the darkened forest like a silver ribbon, its surface shimmering under the moonlight. Relief flooded through him, but there was no time to pause. Gently, he set the baby down on the soft earth, then stepped forward, lowering his head to drink. The first sip sent a shock through his parched body. The water was crisp, pure, washing away the fire that had been burning in his throat. But his thirst was secondary. He turned back to the child, nudging the edge of the blanket closer to the water. Carefully, he pushed a few drops onto the baby's lips with his nose, watching intently for a reaction. A tiny movement, a faint sound. The baby was still alive. For the first time since he found it, Maximus felt something stir deep within him. Hope. Maximus had barely let his guard down when a chilling sound cut through the stillness, the unmistakable rustling of movement in the underbrush. His ears pricked forward, body tensing as his instincts flared to life. He wasn't alone. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest as he turned his head, scanning the darkness. His sharp amber eyes locked onto a pair of glowing yellow orbs lurking just beyond the tree line. Then another pair, and another. Coyotes. They had caught his scent. Worse, they had caught the baby's scent. Maximus positioned himself between the child and the encroaching danger. His body stiffened, muscles coiling like a spring. He had fought for survival countless times before, but never like this. This time, he wasn't just fighting for himself. The lead coyote stepped forward, its head low, eyes locked on its target. Maximus let out a deep, menacing snarl, baring his teeth. The coyote hesitated, but only for a moment. The hunger in its gaze was unmistakable. Then, in a flash of movement, it lunged. Maximus met it head-on, jaws snapping as their bodies collided. Pain seared through his shoulder as another coyote darted in from the side, its teeth sinking into his flesh. He snarled, twisting his massive frame to shake it off, but another enemy was already circling. His breath came in ragged bursts. Blood dripped onto the cold ground. But no matter how exhausted he was, he would not let them reach the baby. With one final earth-shaking growl, Maximus lunged again, sinking his teeth deep into the lead coyote's neck. It yelped in pain, staggering back. The others hesitated. They could sense it now. This was not a fight they would win. One by one, they slinked back into the shadows. Maximus stood his ground, panting, wounded, but victorious. He turned, nudging the baby's tiny form with his nose. It was safe. For now. Maximus stood panting, his breath coming in heavy bursts as he watched the shadows swallow the retreating coyotes. His muscles burned, his wounds stung, but he couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. The baby was still vulnerable. The night was still dangerous. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his body trembling from exhaustion. The weight of the battle clung to him, but he forced himself to keep moving. His ears remained alert, scanning the silent forest for any sign of another threat. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint promise of dawn. But dawn was still far away, and the cold pressed in like an unrelenting force. Then, through the shifting darkness, he saw it. At first, it was nothing more than a shape, a silhouette against the thick canopy of trees. But as he moved closer, his keen eyes made out the jagged outline of walls, A slanted roof barely standing beneath years of neglect. An abandoned cabin. Relief flickered through him, but only briefly. Shelter. It wasn't much, but it was something. Somewhere to rest, to protect the baby from the biting wind and the predators that prowled the night. With renewed determination, Maximus padded forward, his legs unsteady, but his resolve unwavering. As he reached the rotting wooden steps, he nudged the door open with his shoulder. It creaked under the weight, revealing a dark, dust-filled space. Gently, he set the baby down on a patch of dry ground. Then, lowering himself beside it, he curled his massive body around the fragile child. The warmth of his fur shielded it from the cold as his heavy eyes fluttered closed. For the first time that night, Maximus allowed himself to rest. The first rays of dawn crept through the cracks in the cabin's walls, casting faint beams of light across the dust-covered floor. The air was still, save for the rhythmic rise and fall of Maximus's chest as he lay curled protectively around the fragile child. His body ached, his wounds throbbed, but he didn't move. He wouldn't. Not until he was sure the baby was safe. Then, a sound. A soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps on frost-covered leaves. Maximus's eyes snapped open, sharp and alert despite his exhaustion. His ears twitched, nostrils flaring as he caught the scent. Human. His body tensed. He had long learned not to trust their kind. Humans had made him fight, had turned him into a weapon, had abandoned him when he was no longer useful. Through the slats of the broken window, a figure emerged from the thinning fog. A woman. She moved cautiously, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. She was dressed in a worn jacket, hiking boots covered in dust, her face lined with exhaustion. But when her gaze landed on the scene before her, a scarred, battle-worn dog curled around a helpless infant, she froze. Maximus let out a low growl, his massive body shifting ever so slightly to shield the baby from her view. His golden eyes locked onto hers, filled with both warning and something else, a silent plea. The woman's breath hitched. Slowly, carefully, she raised both hands. "It's okay, boy, I won't hurt you." For the first time in his life, Maximus hesitated. Something in her voice, kindness, understanding, cut through his instincts. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, the baby whimpered softly, breaking the silence. And in that moment, Maximus made a choice. He didn't growl, he didn't lunge, he simply stepped aside. The woman's breath remained steady, though her heart pounded against her ribs. She could feel the weight of Maximus's golden eyes watching her every move, gauging, judging. His massive, battle-worn body remained positioned between her and the baby, his stance protective, unwavering. Slowly, she reached into her pocket, her fingers trembling as she pulled out her phone. Her voice was calm but urgent as she whispered into the receiver. "I found them. A baby. And a dog. But he's protecting it. We need help, now." The response on the other end was immediate, the distant echo of sirens soon piercing the cold morning air. The sound made Maximus stiffen. His ears flicked back, his body tensed as if preparing for an attack. To him, sirens had never meant safety, only pain. The woman saw his unease. She took a step closer, her movements slow, careful. "It's okay, boy," she murmured, her voice soft yet firm. "They're coming to help. No one's going to hurt you. You did good. You kept the baby safe." Maximus remained still, his breath shallow. He had spent his life expecting the worst from humans, yet something about this one was different. There was no fear in her eyes, no cruelty, only gratitude. Moments later, the paramedics arrived, their cautious steps crunching against the frost-covered ground. One of them, an older man with kind eyes, crouched down, extending his hand. "Hey there, buddy. You've been through a lot, haven't you?" His voice was gentle, soothing. Maximus didn't growl. He didn't flinch. He simply watched as the man carefully scooped the baby into his arms, wrapping it in a warm blanket, and for the first time, Maximus let go. Maximus lay motionless on the soft blanket in the rescue vehicle, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion. The rhythmic hum of the engine and the distant murmur of voices barely registered in his mind. His wounds had been tended to, his stomach no longer a hollow pit of hunger. But none of that mattered. The baby was gone. Not lost. Safe. Through heavy eyelids, Maximus watched as the paramedics cradled the infant, their hands gentle, their voices soothing. The child was wrapped in a warm, thick blanket now, no longer shivering, no longer fragile against the biting cold. The sight should have brought relief, but instead, an unfamiliar ache settled deep within Maximus's chest. For days, the baby had been his purpose, his burden, his responsibility. And now he was alone again. But fate had one last twist to offer. The soft murmur of new voices filled the air. Two people, a man and a woman, their footsteps hesitant yet full of emotion. Maximus flicked an ear, sensing something different in the way they approached. He lifted his head, his tired amber eyes locking onto the bundle in the woman's arms. The baby. The woman knelt beside him, her expression filled with something he couldn't quite understand. Gratitude? Admiration? Something deeper? She reached out, hesitated for a breath, then gently stroked the scarred fur on his head. "You saved our little one," she whispered. "You belong with us now." The baby stirred, tiny fingers reaching out, grasping at the loose strands of fur on Maximus's ear. And in that moment, he knew. He wasn't alone anymore. The days that followed were unlike anything Maximus had ever known. Gone were the endless nights of cold and hunger, the relentless fight for survival. In their place was something new: warmth, safety, and the quiet hum of a home. At first, he didn't know what to make of it. The soft bed they laid out for him felt foreign beneath his tired body. The gentle voices, the reassuring hands that reached out, not to strike but to comfort, were unfamiliar. He had spent his life fighting, enduring. This was something else entirely. Yet, the baby remained the one constant in his world. Each morning, as sunlight spilled through the windows, Maximus would open his eyes to find the child reaching for him, tiny fingers grasping at his fur. He never moved away. Instead, he let the little hands tug, let the soft giggles fill the air. The scars on his body remained, but inside, something had changed. One afternoon, as he lay stretched across the sun-warmed floor, he felt a familiar weight press against him. The baby, now stronger, nestled into his side, a soft breath against his fur. The woman, watching from across the room, smiled and knelt beside them, running a hand over his head. "You're part of this family, Maximus. You always will be." For the first time in his life, he believed it. He was no longer a fighter, no longer a stray. He was home. Maximus's story is more than just a tale of survival. It is a reminder of the deep, unspoken bond between humans and animals. A once-abandoned warrior, shaped by hardship and pain, found purpose not in fighting, but in protecting something weaker than himself. In saving the child, he saved himself. Animals, like Maximus, have the capacity for love, loyalty, and sacrifice. They are not just creatures of instinct, but beings with emotions, with hearts capable of devotion beyond what we often recognize. Yet, too many are left to fend for themselves, discarded when they are no longer convenient. His journey teaches us a simple but profound truth: kindness changes lives. A single act of compassion can transform fear into trust, loneliness into belonging. If a dog, once conditioned for violence, can choose to protect instead of harm, what does that say about the power of love? Nature, too, gives us endless opportunities for redemption. We are not separate from it, we are part of it. The way we treat animals, the way we care for the world around us, reflects who we are. So let us choose to protect, to nurture, to see the value in every life, because sometimes the ones we rescue end up rescuing us.